Let's get a very warm welcome, though, to Professor Frank Furedi, author and sociologist, of course. Frank, very good morning to you.
Nice to talk to you. Take care.
Nice to talk to you. I'm interested to get your take on the madness that's been going on and eating the BBC from the inside. It would seem as though people are much more obsessed with the BBC, perhaps, than is healthy for the nation. But nonetheless, here we are. It's been a story on the front pages for about the best part of a week. What do you make of it all?
Well, the thing that really I find very interesting is how the BBC has become a law unto itself.
Yeah.
The way in which it's impossible for any outside body, whether it's the government, whether it's the license fee payers, to actually exert any degree of control. So the BBC is this kind of cultural institution that gets to decide what's the political agenda. Although they're meant to be impartial, impartiality has become a total joke over the last couple of decades, as you only basically hear one script being promoted time and time again. And therefore, people like Gary Lineker aren't just simply football commentators. They're actually cultural and political figures, part of the oligarchy that kind of runs the BBC. And it doesn't really matter what you and I or what ordinary people or what even politicians would like to see. They get to decide. And when in a rare instance, they get reprimanded, then they demonstrate their power by being able to rebel and revolt. And they know absolutely clearly that the head of the BBC will cave in. They know absolutely clearly that ultimately they hold all the levers of power there. And that's very dangerous, because basically what we have is a political institution that is culturally hostile to the views of a large number of people, masquerading as a public service institution.
Well, this is the trouble, isn't it? Because it has kind of spread beyond that culture kind of war inside the BBC, because the BBC itself, we are told by sources within it, is riven now by people who have this sort of the haves and the have-nots. You know, the people who make absolutely millions and millions of pounds from the BBC, and others who work in relatively lowly jobs getting paid a pittance, but having to kind of behave themselves while the others do what they like.
Yes, I mean, I can really understand why, that a lot of people there, are on very relatively low salaries, and they really resent the fact that these superstars, these celebrities, are able to, in a sense, live in a different cultural universe where they get to decide what can and cannot be done, and where their behavior is not subject to the same kind of pressure, the same kind of rules as the plebs who are inhabiting the BBC. So there's that kind of internal tension. But I do think that the much bigger problem for me is that I pay my license fee, and yet I've got a service that I don't particularly like. I never hear a real genuine debate, but we have two sides given the same kind of opportunity to promote their views, not just political views, but also cultural views. And I think what I really hate more than anything is this arrogant, sanctimonious sentiment that people like Lineker express, that somehow, football, which is a lovely, great sport, somehow should be a medium for political opinion making.
Well, somebody sort of said to me yesterday that wouldn't it be interesting if you actually asked most football fans what they think of Gary Lineker and what they think of his politics, and most of them would disagree with him, because most football fans live in very ordinary situations in all the ordinary towns and cities of this country, which he knows very little about. And he's insulated from all of that. And there's also this kind of rather supercilious attitude that if you disagree with having completely open borders where nobody's ever asked who they are or asked for ID, or, you're letting everybody into the country, somehow, if you don't agree with that, you're some kind of bigot, some kind of fascist, some kind of, Nazi.
Yeah, I think when you think about the world today, where people like Lineker can so casually use the word Nazi towards people which disagrees, and essentially basically says, you better shut up because Nazis are not allowed to have a voice, you kind of begin to realize that we live in a highly polarized world, which continually attempts to quarantine other opinions from being expressed, because what the whole point about the whole metaphor of being a Nazi, of that term being used, is to silence dissident opinion. And what's really worrying is that, we're not talking about a politician here, a seasoned politician, a political operator. We're talking about a football commentator who's weaponizing football, who's essentially harnessing football towards a very clear political objectives. And I just find that extremely troublesome as a football fan, but also as an ordinary citizen.
Yeah, and I mean, the BBC really has rolled over here. I mean, do you think that the chairman will remain in place, because the baying mob have now got themselves into full fury? They now think that they've won, that Gary Lineker and his nice, kinder, gentler politics have won the day, and that soon we'll get rid of all the Tories in the BBC. I mean, that's kind of where it's going.
Well, it doesn't really matter whether he's going or not, because he's quite impotent. Although he's formally the head of the BBC, he's really limited by the fact that the balance of power in his organization is one that's continually constraining him from, in a sense, embarking on an independent path. I think that it's highly likely that he'll go. It depends entirely upon the government, whether the government has got the will to kind of stay firm and has got the will to basically stick for the kind of political principles that it's meant to be promoting. I'm not really sure, sort of how committed they are and how willing they are to risk taking on the BBC. And I suspect what they're finally realizing is that they've lost control over every single political and cultural institution that's run by public money. They don't control the civil service, they don't control the educational sector, and they don't control the museum and sector and the BBC. It's almost like as if they're aliens in their own territory.
It really is. It's been an extraordinary time, and it's been sort of topped off by the way, by the end of last week's situation with Fiona Bruce. Fiona Bruce, who apparently is being accused of supporting domestic violence by issuing what I would have said was a perhaps rather clumsy piece of information that she was obviously asked to hand out when the subject of domestic violence came up on Question Time last week, when Yasmin Alibhai-Brown accused Stanley Johnson of breaking his wife's nose. And clearly, as we all know in that sort of situation, she had to clarify something. As I say, it did look a bit clumsy and all of that, but she's now had to step down from her role as an ambassador for some charity. Now, maybe that tells you something about why journalists shouldn't be ambassadors for charities.
But I think there's a bigger issue here, which is the climate of hysteria.
Yeah.
Where you make an act of miscommunication, where, as you say something that's a little bit clumsy, and suddenly you become a cultural criminal, and suddenly you become accomplice in abuse and basically condoning violence, domestic violence. And I think that silly way of behaving, where literally all you need is a couple of people to complain. They go on Twitter, they kind of make a fuss on social media, and your life becomes hell. And I really feel for this particular woman, Fiona Bruce, because in a sense she's done nothing that's remotely wrong, and yet she's forced to apologize for making a very human error that you and I would make, 2 or 3 times a day. And yet, suddenly, she becomes this different individual, this nice person is suddenly recast into a role of this cultural monster. And that the ease with which this happens should make all of us think about what can we do to contain this climate of hysteria.
Yes. I'm not sure what you can do, because it does seem to be growing, People have to apologise every single day of the week. People have to step down or step aside or step back, because of something that's been said. It's a mad kind of world, and it's a mad way to live, isn't it?
It is, but, all we need is about 2 or 3 TV personalities, a few sports personalities to refuse to play the game. All we need is a small cohort of prominent individuals who refuse to apologize, explain, okay, I'm sorry, I made a little mistake, but, we're human beings. Haven't you made a mistake like this in your life? And I think we have to be much braver in containing this pressure that is focused upon us. And I really do wish that we abolished the apology, this ritual of apology, which has become so trivial now that its original meaning has been lost.
Yeah.
You just stand up and say, look, I'm not going to live in a world where I cannot open my mouth for the fear of offending somebody, for a fear of saying the wrong words. That is life. In everyday life, we make those kinds of mistakes. We need to forgive each other for those.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to end this particular segment. Stay with us, though, Frank. We've got more to talk about coming up. We're going to be getting more stuck into some of the things that Frank's been writing about in the past week or so as well. This is Talk TV.